nice introduction. So, age. I think if Lynn McTaggart can come out and say she's not dyeing her hair anymore. I turned 60 this year. It's a secret. Soon to be all over the internet when Carl puts these videos up.
Did you say 16?
What?
Did you say 16?
Yeah, 16. 16. You misheard me, didn't you? Yes, and it's kind of an interesting sort of thing that happens to you with age as time goes on. You start looking at life differently. And today what we're going to be looking at is how to attract what you really want. It's going to be a review of the law of attraction, what I used to call manifesting. When I first heard about manifesting about 15 years ago, I didn't believe it. I really didn't believe it. I thought, it can't be so simple. You could think of something, visualize it, energize it, make it happen, and then it would. Impossible, I thought. So then I got curious. You know, my dad was an inventor, so I have a kind of a scientific mind. I'm a bit skeptical, very challenging, and really honest. So, you know, I was thinking, I've got to try it and see if it works. Some of the people I respected the most were using it. So I thought, well, I've got to explore this for myself. And when I started kind of exploring the whole thing about manifesting, I discovered I've been doing it all along. And I bet you have too. So when Carl asked me to do this talk on the law of attraction, I went, yeah, that's great. Because in fact, my first book, Compassionate Coaching, was all about that. And I had just finished healing my brain tumor at that time. And I realized that what I'd wanted all through that time of trying to heal for 10 years was a result. And I realized the law of attraction is about getting what you want, getting the result. Now, isn't that what we all want? You know, and particularly in the healing world. I worked as an osteopath and a naturopath for 20 years. And I know that when people come in with pain, they want to go out without it, right? They want a result. So one of the gifts of healing work is that you get a measurement, immediate measurement. Is there an improvement in the symptoms or not? The gift of that is that, you know, well, that's the challenge. The gift is that you get that measurement. The challenge is that it can be hard to deliver. And I started looking at this, particularly for myself. How can I get the result I want? And for 10 years, this stumped me because I was doing everything right according to the law of attraction. But for some reason, it wasn't happening. And I was using NLP extensively, working on all my issues, all the aspects of all my issues, until I ran out of issues. And it still didn't change. So, you know, talk about feeling like a failure. It was really very interesting. Then I met Carl about 2 years ago at the Conscious Medicine Conference up in Findhorn. And of course I'd heard the wonderful story about how he and Sasha had written a book about the Matrix. And they published it themselves, and then Hay House heard about it, how successful it was, and they took it over, and now they're mega successful, and it was spreading worldwide. And I'm going, to be honest, I'm a little jealous. But I knew enough to say, jealous? That's interesting. Because if somebody said, oh, they just made £1 million writing code for a new software company, I wouldn't have been jealous. So the thing about jealousy is it lets you know what you want. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't realized I'd like to be published by Hay House. That's a good idea. I would like to write another book and have it be published by Hay House. I had no idea what I'd be writing about. Within a month, I had a phone call from the managing director of Hay House that said, would you like to have lunch? And over lunch, she said, do you know, Arielle, if you felt like writing something, we'd be very interested in looking at it. And I went home after that lunch and I suddenly went, I think that was an invitation. And so I set to write a book, and I wrote about 3 or 4 chapters, showed it to them, and then they said, we'd like to write your book, publish your book, but not this one. Rewrite it. So I did. And that's been my second book. And this is also about how to get results, but I've chunked it down to healing. So today what I want to do is look at the law of attraction with the idea of how can we apply it to specific things. Okay, so a lot of you don't know who I am. What you really need to know about who I am is just that I'm, according to Carl, completely mainstream. Because yesterday he said, if you've been discredited, if your certificates all over your wall all have no value, then you must be mainstream, right? And my walls are covered with certificates. NLP is now formally discredited if you read Wikipedia, if you believe Wikipedia. Osteopathy has never been fully, okay, right? It's not, now it's got a registration, but it's still not mainstream. And all the other things I've done, hypnosis, EFT, Matrix, where you name it, it's not got that stamp of credibility. So I must be mainstream now. Thanks, Carl. I never thought of it that way. Okay, so anyway, I got really curious about what we were going to, how we could make the law of attraction into getting the results we wanted. And I started to ask myself, what stops us? What's going on here? And first off, how do our thoughts manifest everything anyway? We know that they do, but how does that happen? And does it really happen? How come we don't always get what we want? And that particularly applied to me until I did heal my tumor. And after I got that healing, I began to backtrack to see what worked, what didn't work, what were the key factors that actually made it work. And then I tested it on all my clients and continued to use it very successfully. I also looked at why is it easier to manifest small things? How many here are good at doing parking spaces? Yeah, I'm great at getting parking spaces. Wherever I go, I just think I want to park right in front of that restaurant, right in front of that venue, blah, 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 and there it is. And one day I noticed that a very dear friend of mine had the opposite belief. He said, there's never going to be parking there. There's no point in even driving into town because we'll never get parking. It's all crowded, blah, blah, blah. And of course, if we got in the car and went, his belief was true. He never found a parking space. And I thought, that's really interesting. It obviously works so well on small things. How can we get it to work on bigger things? Then, of course, there's the misunderstanding about, well, if our thoughts make everything happen, when bad things happen, is that my fault too? Because most people, when they get a diagnosis, they don't think that they had anything to do with it. They're still in the mindset of, my body has nothing to do with me. I prefer to think this illness came from outer space, landed in my body, and took over. It's this terrible saboteur that I have to have chopped out of me. And in fact, I was just talking to a client the other day who's received a diagnosis of grade 2 cervical cancer. It took them a whole year to discover what it was because there were so many other things going on. It's already metastasized to her lungs. She's got a huge infection going on in her whole abdomen and a few other things as well. So she hasn't started treatment yet, and she's one of these people who is completely living in her head. Maybe you've met some people like this. She's totally competent, working hard, has a great career, lovely relationship. She's very, efficient and not at all upset about the diagnosis. She's very pragmatic about it. And when you talk to her about, issues, no, had a great life. Feelings, hasn't had one for years. What do? I mean, it's really interesting. So what I do with people like that is I read symptoms, kind of like what Rob was talking about earlier. Understanding a person's metaphors for their body can help you to determine what are the messages that your body's trying to give you. Because I look at the body as a computer printout of your mind. All the feelings you've ever felt, all the memories you've stored, all the thoughts that you think on a repetitive basis. So that computer printout, if you get sensitive to it, you can read what it's trying to say. Because it doesn't speak very loudly, but it speaks very loudly through symptoms. Then, of course, there's other factors. I've thought of quite a few. And there may be more. These were just off the top of my head. The first thing is that when somebody is stressed, or they're in pain, which is kind of the same thing, it locks down the front part of the brain so that you can't access the frontal lobes. So all the energy from the stress response switches you into the hindbrain, which is your fight, flight, stress response area of the brain. It's the reptilian brain. And you become reactive, but not cognitive. And so it's like having a frontal lobotomy. You can't access the part of your brain that could figure it out. You can only have a reaction to it. So you're at a complete disadvantage the minute you go into stress. Now, the more you understand about human beings, the more compassionate I think you can become. Because when you understand that people behave in certain ways or they have responses in certain ways because of what's going on in their whole body and their system, then you realize, hey, they're just in trouble. They just need a way to get out of that trouble. Second thing is when you're confused and you have no idea what you want, you have no clarity, how can you go anywhere? And of course, what's the hardest question on the planet? What do you want? What do you want? And of course, when somebody's got an illness, you kind of assume that they want to get better. They assume they want to get better. But wait a minute, something's wrong with this picture. If they really wanted to be healthy, if they really wanted to be better, would they have gotten ill in the first place? Part of them doesn't. The part of them that created the illness is trying to get attention for some other purpose entirely. So it isn't completely true to say they want to be well. Sometimes they don't want to be well at all. Sometimes there's secondary gains. Sometimes they're avoiding the real issue. They know what the real issue is, but they don't want to face it. Maybe you've come across a few like that, and that's where EFT can be so valuable, where you can calm a person down and help them to be able to open up, to look at the real issues. They can be attached to the status quo. They can like things the way they are, not upset the apple cart. I had one client who had a very serious graded breast cancer. I can't remember exactly what the grading was now. And she opted for the surgery, the chemotherapy, and the radiotherapy. And I was kind of shocked because she was one of my students. She'd done all my trainings and she'd assisted with me for years. And I went, she didn't even stop to question? And I was really surprised. And because my golden rule is I never intrude on a person's process. A person asks me for help, I'm there for them 150%. But I never intrude on a person's decisions. But I stood back and I watched the picture and I remembered that she'd also been going through a terrible marriage. And she was still in this terrible marriage. And a few years before the breast cancer, she had almost decided to divorce her husband. And I talked her out of it. I said, it's not easy on the other side. You're not going to have the best time in your life living in an apartment all by yourself. Your kids will come to visit, but it's not going to be, happy families anymore. And I made her look realistically at the choice she was making. And in the end, she chose to stay in this marriage that was not very good. But what happened when she was diagnosed with breast cancer? Her husband changed. He suddenly became caring. He looked after her. He drove her to the hospital. He gave her sympathy. She was allowed to stay home. Instead of being mean to her the way he always had been before, he now treated her like his princess. Was this a secondary gain? She got to stay home scot-free, not have to work anymore. She took up painting. She took up other hobbies. She had a lovely life. Her daughter got married, had a baby. Her son got married, had twins. Is she the happiest mother on earth now? She's got everything she wanted because she chose to go down a different route. That's a healing. So I said, oh, I see why she didn't question it. She made the right decision. So sometimes the attachment to the status quo isn't a bad thing. Hidden secondary gains and how people benefit from having their illness is really phenomenally important and needs to be addressed very early on when you're listening to their story, particularly for the first time. Influence from others. We've been talking about energy fields. And if you live in an energy field with other people around you who are influencing you to feel a certain way, it's quite likely you'll pick things up from that. So you want to think about who is having an influence on you, or who is having an influence on the person you're working with that might be part of the issue. Attachment to results. This was the key factor of my whole healing. And I noticed that it's one that creeps into the medical kind of understanding without us realizing it. As soon as we have pain, as soon as we have an illness, as soon as we have a diagnosis, we assume we want to get better, we want a result, right? Yeah, it's a given, right? So that attachment to getting the result is like, it's like almost an addiction for some people. They get so attached. They want it so much, they want it too much. And it wasn't until I addressed being too attached to my own need to be fully better that I was able to get fully better. And it was kind of an interesting kind of shift in my consciousness. Limiting self-beliefs, well, we've all got those. You know those more than any other group I've ever spoken to. Lack of awareness, a little bit more subtle, but I'm sure you're familiar with that. Fate and destiny could be an issue that holds people back. Maybe it's their destiny to leave the planet. We all have to go sometime. And I like to say, we all get on the same train eventually. It's just a question of the 4 o'clock or the 6 o'clock or the 8 o'clock. It's a different train. A belief in time. A belief that time is a factor, which, going back to being 60, people say often that they think I'm much younger than I am. And that's because I think I'm much younger than I am. I still think I'm 40. And I don't believe in time. And I don't buy into people believing in time. So I do mean it's a secret. If anybody comes up to me and says, "Oh, you don't look your age," please don't, because I'm not. I'm only 40. And I don't want you to upset my belief system. It works. If you maintain a young attitude and you still think like a young person and you behave like a young person and you treat yourself like, you will stay young. And they've proved this. You've probably heard of those experiments where they took a whole group of geriatrics who were, feeble and, hardly able to move with their arthritis, and they stuck them in a camp, and they played the music of their teenage years, and they made them play games and talk only about the time of their teenage years. And their arthritis went away, and they started having a wonderful time, and their depression left, their illnesses got better. It works. So we can do that. We can stay young as long as we want to. Finally, there's a lack of trust. And trust is phenomenally important. We'll be talking about that a little bit more. We know from all the talks we've had previously that all of our thoughts radiate energy. And I once had the great honor of meeting this wonderful scientist. He worked with Thomas Edison. I mean, can you imagine all those boffins? He used to work with Thomas Edison. I met 2 of them. And they were fascinating people, absolutely fascinating. And Charlie Goodman was his name. Charlie his passion was ham radios. And he said, "Arielle, did you know that when you set off a radio wave, it sets off a wave, and that wave keeps going around the world for eternity. It never stops. It keeps going around and around and around. If you have the instrumentation to tune into that wave and pick it up, you can listen to that radio station. Below the water, that means we're unconscious of a great deal of what's gone on before. Now, one of the things that I've struggled with for many years is my own spider phobia. And Carl thinks this is a challenge. But I have done 20 years of NLP. I've done the spider phobia of NLP many, many times. Didn't do anything. Diminished it maybe 2 points out of 10. So I've tried matrix work on it twice. And I thought, before I go to Australia, I've got to sort this. Because the reason why I hadn't gone to Australia for the last 10 years was because I was afraid of spiders. And I thought, I know I'm going to see some mega spiders there, and I don't want to have some kind of horrible phobic attack. So anyway, I did the matrix work, I thought, right, I'm prepared. I'm brave, I'm going to Australia. And when I arrived in Queensland, my friend had this beautiful flat. It was, all marble and glass, and it was on the first floor. So I thought, we're not on the ground. Had a balcony each side, but I thought I wasn't worried. There were no flying insects. And I thought, that's really weird. I hadn't seen one mosquito. It was all clean. And she said, "Why are you laughing?" And I said to my friend, I said, "How come there's no flying insects?" And she said, "Oh, they spray this area regularly." But she said, because I'm such a health freak, I told them they couldn't spray my flat. But I never see any insects. Never see any insects at all. The very next morning, I walk into the bathroom. It's one of those, wet rooms where the shower is flat with the floor, with this big glass wall, but it's just a partition that goes halfway, and there's this ginormous spider in the shower, and I freak. I totally freak. And it's still, and I froze. So we're both staring at each other. And then it started to move. And it couldn't remember the way out of the shower at first, and finally it did, and it started creeping around the room. And then it started going very fast. By this time I was screaming. And my friend Rose, who is not afraid of spiders, came with a dustpan and brush. Dustpan and brush. And she goes in, I'm standing back like 10 feet away watching through the doorway. And she's trying to pick up this huge spider on a dustpan and brush. And she loses it. And it's running like lightning now because it's upset. And she yells out, "Oh, it's okay, Arielle, he's gone." And she's got this wicker basket full of towels. And I can see him climbing around the wicker. I said, "No, he's not behind the wicker basket." So I knew my spider phobia wasn't cured. She finally did get him on the dustpan. And because she wasn't afraid, he wasn't afraid, he sat there and allowed her to take him to the balcony and toss him out. I was dumbfounded. But by then I was freaked out. And for the rest of my stay in Australia, I was looking everywhere. I wasn't calm for the rest of my stay. It just completely sort of put me into spider frequency. By the way, do you know there's at least 3 causes for phobias? I didn't know this, and this is why it probably hasn't worked on me yet. Do you remember, I'm curious. When things don't work, I don't say, well, that wasn't a good technique. I say, why didn't it work? Do you know what the 3 ways are? Obviously, we know the one way, which is one serious traumatic event, right? Go back and heal that traumatic event. But then there's the metaphorical way. You can make a metaphor and have a phobia because this metaphor is related to something else. And I've tried working on that one. The 3rd way, though, is you can learn to tune into the frequency of the phobia. Now, I didn't have one traumatic event for spiders. I had hundreds of little events, but no one traumatic event. But my father was bitten by a black widow. And my father nearly died twice by black widow bites. And then he had to battle tarantulas in Morocco. So he had stories about spiders that he taught me. And he must have taught me those stories with great fear. And so I tuned into the fear of spiders and learned it by tuning into my dad. So I think that I have to work on it in a new way, so I will ask for some assistance if somebody would like to accept the challenge and work with me yet again on my spider phobia. I'd love to heal this. Comment? Yes?
In terms of phobias, ancestral, it's really, really strong, and so even if your father hadn't talked about it, but something as real as that, whereas it was a near-death experience, it's very crucial that would get passed down to you for your survival.
But I did pass trauma on him.
But it may go back further than that as well.
Yeah, I don't know. But I did go back into his life and tried to heal his spider phobia. I'd thought of that one. I thought ancestral, absolutely, could be. And then I thought past life, it could be past life. It could be lots of things. It's like, okay, one day I'm going to find the answer. And I've also looked at the secondary gains. There aren't very many.
Did you actually work on when he told you these stories?
It's hard because he told them so many times.
There'd be a key time when you was traumatised, though.
No, I can't remember a key time.
Okay, well maybe that's where you need to go next.
I wouldn't want you to think that I'm one of those people that's stuck in my head, but I have no idea. Of course, you teach what you most need to learn, don't you? Okay, so lots of times what I notice is that when people speak well, and in the NLP world, people learn how to speak properly, politically correct speaking. And maybe you've noticed that too when you've done a lot of work on yourself and you want to be more spiritually evolved, you talk in a way that is not like the way normal people talk. And you couch everything in the positive. And positive speak has become very popular, in sort of our culture now. So people will say very positive things with their head part, their conscious mind. They'll say, I want to heal. But underneath that, they have the attitude of battle. So they are fighting their illness. They are wanting to get rid of it. This is how I was. And we're encouraged to think this way. The battle against cancer. You must fight. You must have the will to survive, right? We have all these metaphors for fighting illness. I do my best. That sounds good. I just do my best. But secretly, the rest of you is going, but I have to be perfect. And I have to win. The next one is, I work hard. I must succeed, is what's going on below, because it could be resting on a whole slew of beliefs underneath that. I'm responsible. I know that I'm 100% responsible for what happens in my life. And the bad side, the mistake that people make, is that means I'm guilty. It's all my fault. God, I failed again. I connect with my friends because I need attention. I need them to like me. I give my love. I must get my needs met. I like things to be nice. I must be in control of everything. Everything must be just so. Anybody here orderly? Have a very neat as a pin house? Look at your control. It's interesting. How irritating is it to be around somebody who is a complete mess? When they just walk in and everything goes all over the place. And you can try to, for a while, you're going, oh yeah, that's cool, that's right. Pushing it away. Okay, so conscious and unconscious thoughts. The second problem is we have such limited awareness, such limited perception. And I'm always smiling when people come on my NLP courses. They are so used to seeing the world through their eyes and hearing the world through their ears and feeling things, but they're picking up only a very, very small percentage, a hugely small percentage. And they've estimated that every second we have more than 2 million bits of information flooding our senses. 2 million bits in this room are flooding your senses every second. But your mind cannot possibly process 2 million bits per second. Even your unconscious mind can't process. I think it's been estimated you can process about 145 per second. 145 out of 2 million? That means you can't possibly be taking in everything in this room. So consciously, we only take in 7 plus or 2 bits per second. That's a very small bit of reality that we're taking in. What's even more disturbing is we may not be taking in it at all. We may be just projecting it out from our own beliefs. And that's something we have to look at more carefully. The unconscious mind, as we know, has been pretty much fully programmed by the age of 7. And it's a jumble of stuff. It's not in any kind of systematic order. There's a whole lot of information in there that hasn't been processed, hasn't been resolved, and it's a mess. It's kind of like a jumble of Christmas tree lights. So it's full of fantasies, it's full of faulty logic, intellectualizing, feelings, and of course the need to be good, need to be seen, need to have an identity, all those needs. So we know all that. And the problem with the law of attraction is we come along to make something happen, and we're all positive. We say, we want to have a result. But thinking a positive thought like that and setting a goal, even if you do a vision board, even if you do all the right things, isn't going to be enough. And as Louise Hay says, before you can clean your house, you need to see the dirt. You need to get down into the bits that really need to be cleaned out. And how do you find them? Now, Rob gave you one way. I'm going to give you some others. The third problem, though, is that the thoughts that we think on a repetitive basis build walls in our head. And these walls create a lot of barriers to our ability for our senses to take in information. Did you know? As soon as you believe something fully and completely, your brain blocks all evidence to the contrary. Maybe you've met people like this. People who have such a mindset that you can flood them with evidence, research, books, speakers, famous people that have done this, evidence right in front of their face, and what do they say? Nope, don't believe that. Right? You met people like this. So these walls are built of all the things that you would call aspects. And I was working with somebody not long ago. He was a fellow who, if I describe him as very successful, handsome, happy, confident. He works as a salesman presenter. So he gets up in front of hundreds and thousands of people, gives talks, has written a book. He's phenomenally okay. You know, he's got 3 kids, nice relationship. Everything in his life is fine. So why did he come to see me? He said, well, Arielle, I've had panic attacks 3 times in my life, really, really bad ones. I said, oh, really? He's the last person in the world that I would ever have thought would have fear or a panic attack. He said, well, the first time I was working for L'Oreal, and I had this terrible job. He was in the sales department of L'Oreal. And I had a boss that was horrible to me, and I wasn't happy there. I didn't like the work, and it destroyed my confidence. I couldn't please this boss. My results were terrible, and I had a panic attack. And it took me a whole year with medication to get out of it. That was the first one. Second one, several years later, his wife and he had their first child and got very excited, and they spent money. They spent a lot of money. They got 80,000 pounds in debt. And when he realized he was 80,000 pounds in debt, he freaked out and had a major panic attack. Understandable, yeah? Took him 2 years to get out of it that time. He was really shaken. A few more years went by. He got himself out of debt. They had a couple more kids. Everything was fine. His work was great. He was now had his own business. He was making lots of money. He had never been more successful. He had never been happier. Everything was great. His kids were healthy and happy. Everything was fine. And he had a panic attack. I thought, whoa, that's kind of weird. What happened? This time it took him 2 years again to get out of the panic attack. So years had gone by, and he said, here I am. I'm scared. I don't know when the next one might hit. It could be anything, because I don't know what caused it, and I don't know what got out of it. I said, oh, interesting. Now, while he'd been talking, I've been taking notes, because I do, and I've done Post-it notes. And every time I heard a belief or an emotion or anything that could be something important, put it on a Post-it note. And I started putting these on a page, almost at random, and kind of connecting them up. And some of them seemed more important than others. So I asked him the kind of question you would probably ask, which would be, well, what in your childhood had the elements of, some of the elements were feeling like a complete failure, feeling not good enough, being scared or angry, those were the emotions that came up more than anything, and feeling that you had to win, that it was all your responsibility to get out of it. What had that? And ding! Immediately found an episode in his childhood. Now, just as a matter of interest, this was some of his Post-it notes. You may or may not, can you read that? There's an awful lot of them. This was the picture that we made of his thought cloud in his head. And these are all different aspects of his problem. And the story from his childhood, just so you know, is that it started with his father. His father happened to be the headmaster of his local school. His father was also a keen sportsman, the kind of guy who was good at every sport and always won. And this man was the eldest child of this father. And the father really wanted his child to be as good as he was. So he was pushed and pushed and pushed. Unfortunately, he wasn't so good at sports, nor was he the cleverest boy at school, and his father had been a superstar at school in every subject. So here was the headmaster of the school pushing his son, and sometimes his son discovered that he got given awards or prizes or a little, boost here or there because his father had pulled some strings. So what were the messages he got from that? Can you imagine some of the messages he got? What would you say? He'd have to believe. One was he had to win. Winning was really important. If he didn't win, if he didn't get top marks, he wasn't good enough, right? But if he did win, here was the crunch, if he did win, did he really win? He was always suspicious that his father had done it for him. So it pulled the rug out from under his feet. He could never get the satisfaction of thinking, I did that. He never got that. So this led to a feeling of kind of hopelessness and a fear that he would let people down and that he didn't deserve approval. He also felt stupid because he knew he wasn't getting those good marks and those winnings by his own means. So winning meant nothing. And this, if you notice the arrows, it was just like a never-ending loop. Like worse than a double bind, worse than a treble bind. It was just like this incredible nested loop of beliefs that one went into the other, into the other, into the other, into the other. And then it sort of went up into the top where he would start to trash what he did. He'd have this deep-seated anger, which didn't come out because he was such a positive person, but it was in his body. And he had no idea who he really was. He was like, duh, I don't know my true identity. He would hide behind the strong people. He felt trapped. He thought he must get out. He couldn't get out. He didn't know how to get out. So around the loop he would go again. Now what was interesting as we talked this over and started to do work on a couple of the aspects was where the big black arrows were some of the ways in. And what I deduced from listening to his story was that all 3 episodes of his panic attack were the same issue, which is I have to win, I have to be successful in order to be okay and loved. But if I am successful, winning means nothing. So if he loses, it would trigger it. But if he won, it would also trigger it. Do you see what I mean? I mean, he was just scuppered both ways. He couldn't get out of that. And that's why the panic attacks would happen, whether he was winning or whether he was losing. So we undid some of the drama from the childhood experience and gave him some much stronger and more positive beliefs. But you can't remove those and leave a vacuum. Because if you just remove them and you don't give them some really positive resource to put instead, the danger is that it can reinstall itself. Any questions on that before I move on? Definitely hush.
How did you get him out of it?
Okay, I worked on the childhood experience with his father. So we went back and we did what you would call matrix work on his childhood experience. I think it was about age 6 was the worst one.
And
That cleared most of it. We did other work too. Now you might look at that and say, better do it all. And in the early days, when I was first starting doing this work with clients, I thought I had to do it all. And I didn't know where to start because I didn't have a way of kind of sussing out what was the beginning point. And then I realized it didn't really matter, but it was more efficient and far more elegant if you could find the deepest source, the one that would cure the most. If you see all the arrows, where all the arrows connect to is probably the most important one. But if you see the one in the middle, I'm not good enough, connects to quite a few. But it's the hardest one to turn around all by itself. So you have to work at it from different angles until the person knows their true inner worth, their true magnificence, and they have a different sense of who they really are. It ultimately comes down to their identity. So this is about clearing the dirt. Before you can manifest what you really want, you need to clean the house. You need to see the dirt. So you have to see all the dirt. Now, secondary gains were somewhat important to him, but not really. For some other people, they can be more important. And some of the famous, most important secondary gains you're probably familiar with. Everybody here knows secondary gains? Yeah? Oh, I don't have to talk about this then. So it's one of the aspects that gets in the way. Another one, if you want the fast track, for those who think they are okay, for those who think they're really totally evolved, go and see somebody you don't like very much. Go home and visit your family and listen to what goes on in your head. Listen to the judgments. Because whatever you are saying in your mind, the judgments that you're projecting there onto the other people are probably going to reflect what you next need to work on. Because what you see in someone else has to reflect something in you. That's the only way you can see it. So other people, particularly your family and the people that kind of rub you the wrong way, they are gifts. They are gifts to you. Have you ever had the experience of meeting somebody for the first time and you think, oh God, you know, it's like one of those Gary Larson cartoons where he's sitting on the plane and this absolute troll gets on the plane, the only empty seat on the plane is next to him, right? Go, oh no, don't let him sit there, don't let him sit there. And the troll sits there, right? It's like if you meet somebody for the first time and you think, oh my God, this person is like nobody I ever want to meet. And then you get to be best friends. Has that ever happened to you? And you discover what amazing people they are. This has happened to me many times where, you know, I'm so surprised that my initial reaction to somebody wasn't completely positive, and yet later on, I love that person. I absolutely love them. I remember once I was working with this barrister, and he was in a terrible state. He came in, his wife wanted to divorce him. He was really fed up. They had 3 young children who they absolutely adored, and they just couldn't get on. He sat down in my office, and he could speak at the rate of knots. I mean, it was like some kind of machine gun going off, and it was on and on and on about my wife is this, she does this, I don't like this, on and on and on, and more pathos and more anger. And I'm sitting there going, and I noticed a little twinkle in his eye. I'm listening, and I noticed this little twinkle in his eyes. And finally, after about 45 minutes, maybe it was a whole hour, I started giggling. And the more I started to hold it back, the harder I had to laugh. And I started laughing so hard, I nearly fell off my chair. And this guy's sitting there looking at me going, I'm telling you the worst story in my life, and you're laughing at me. Yes, I don't believe you. Because of the twinkle in his eye, I could hear another voice that wanted to speak. And he said, you're right. He said, I really love my wife. After an hour of all this diatribe, he said, yeah, I really love my wife, and I'd really like to heal this relationship. I said, great, now we can work. But I could have believed him. So listen to the judgments in your own mind. The other thing is that's related to the deeper cause. Everything, not just the people, but everything you see in your life is a mirror. So I love this. I call it the magical mystery tour of life, you know. And I have friends that I go on magical walks with. And we will maybe have an issue or a problem that we want to sort. I said, let's go for a walk. And maybe we'll go for a walk in the park. And whatever we see becomes metaphorically significant. And we go off into these wonderful